in there myself because I wanted to just point out in particular that the digital divide isn't just referring to the first point, access to the internet or communication technologies. Yes, it is a big problem that there are a lot of people who don't have access to the internet, but it's also a problem that between different communities, people are using these technologies in different ways. Different communities have learned to use different tools on the internet. And as a result, also, different communities are being impacted in totally different ways. Some communities might be more educated to use a lot of research tools or tools where they are using data in a way that they know can protect their own community or bring political and economic power into their own community and strengthen their own community. So I just wanted to make that distinction that the digital divide is not just as simple as access to the internet, but of course it is a huge part of it. And so this was a statistic that I found in a few different places, but it's from the Pew Research Center. About 15% of US households with school-age children don't have high-speed internet access at home. That's a really high number, and when you think about it in terms of the number of homework assignments that happen online anymore, it's no wonder why nearly 20% of children have trouble turning in homework assignments that are they need the internet to turn in, or that they need the internet to complete the assignments in the first place. This can put, unfortunately, it can put certain demographics at a big disadvantage when just trying to, when they're just trying to get their education. So already we're seeing that, unfortunately, some people don't have the same access to education as others. And this is another statistic, but more particular to Detroit. Since 2015, Detroit has been one of the country's worst connected cities. In a city with a median household income of $26,249, 38% of homes have no internet connection. 63% of low-income homes have no in-home broadband, and 70% of school-age children have no internet access at home. This really speaks to some of the problems that are going on in Detroit in relation to the rest of the country. I mean, 15% of kids who don't have access to the internet is bad enough, but 70%, that is just, that's really horrible that we would allow a location in a city in our own country to be at such a political, economic, and social disadvantage. And so thinking about the digital divide in terms of what's happening right now with COVID-19, I've already kind of mentioned that it does unfairly affect certain students, that the digital divide does affect students, but think about it now when a lot of schools are closing down and are not meeting in person to protect the students from this virus. And a lot of schools are trying to opt to transition to online curriculums, but it's unfortunate when there are also still so many students who don't have access to the internet at home. And so during this outbreak, it's particularly more challenging because now all of this education, all of the school education is happening online for certain, in certain areas in some places. And so we can also think about this happening with how does this affect workers? I mean, there are a lot of people who don't have jobs where they use the internet and they don't use computers. And some of those, some people who work in those jobs, it's possible that they never had the choice to have a job where they worked on a computer. And frankly, so there are just large numbers of people who, don't really have access to being able to work on a computer at home during this time. And so either have to continue going to work where they might be putting themselves at risk. And in some cases, they don't have the opportunity to work at all. So I just wanted to kind of pay a little bit of respect to COVID-19, as this is what's going on right now. Of course, you know, with a lot of presentations going on right now, a lot of different conferences, I also have friends who are trying really hard to broadcast certain presentations. But some of my friends in Mexico, for example, don't have particularly strong internet connection. And so they're really struggling to get some of the word out about the topics that they're trying to present on. And so I've kind of been pointing to it the whole time a little bit, but why does the digital divide actually matter? And if I were to put it shortly, I would really just try to say that unfortunately, if people don't have access to the internet, it really puts them at a huge disadvantage. And I guess the first way that we could start, the first thing that I would point to anyway is that how many jobs do you have to apply for online anymore? If you don't have internet access, it becomes increasingly challenging to apply for jobs. If you aren't educated in using these tools, then it becomes increasingly challenging to apply for jobs. And I think that's just the first thing, right? But there's so much more to it than that. It's not just about being able to apply for jobs. It's also about being able to have access to information and communication resources so that you can be in touch with people in your community. So many people are using the internet as a way of organizing the things that are the events and activities that are going on in their own communities. And if you don't know about those things, then you unfortunately might not be able to make connections in your own community, and it might be more challenging to participate politically in your own community, in your own local government, or to, as I've been saying, like get a job and really be able just to participate in your economy at all. And so I think the big question here is like, how do we fix this problem? How do we fix the digital divide? And I guess I shouldn't be talking about it as though it's one thing. It's not really one thing. There are many digital divides because there are many different ways that the digital divide affects different people. And I personally could not speak to all of them because I don't know about everything that's going on in every community, but I know that there are so many communities that are being affected in totally different ways. So the first organizations that I would look to fix this problem are the network operators, the cable companies, who have laid the infrastructure for the internet. And right, I mean, like they've done a ton of digging and laying wires like all over the place so that people can get access to this one like centralized source, this one like really centralized network. And unfortunately, there are a bunch of communities that don't have the infrastructure in their communities to actually get access to the internet. And it seems to me like it's the job of the network operators to make this happen. Like that seems like the reason why they should exist is to be laying that infrastructure. But unfortunately, they are sort of hindered because it's not necessarily always profitable to be laying that infrastructure, especially when you create the infrastructure in places, in communities that can't actually afford the service in the first place. So then if you lay the infrastructure, they aren't going to be able to afford to get an internet plan. So why lay the infrastructure? That's unfortunately like one of the things that seems like it has like mostly hindered these organizations from actually continuing to grow this infrastructure, which seems like a human right at this point in the age of information where people really need that access to the internet. And so like, it seems as though we should have some way of trying to incentivize this further, like incentivize creating this infrastructure. And so I guess the next people that you would look to is like, okay, there are these individuals that are having a hard time within these marginalized communities and still are struggling to get this internet connection that these network operators aren't building. So is there something that local governments can do? And so there are local governments that have tried to make plans and to lay this infrastructure, and some have been more successful than others. But unfortunately, another thing that's happened is these network operators have again hindered this process, basically by claiming and lobbying that the local governments like creating competition for these network operators is against the law. So in many states now, it's actually illegal for local governments to actually provide municipal internet. That's not the case here in Massachusetts, but it is the case in a lot of places around the world, and there has been some controversy around this. So, you know, just back to the point about the network operators building this infrastructure, like it seems like it's what they're supposed to do, but not only are they not doing it, but when local governments try to do it, they don't work with them. They say, you're not allowed to do that because they're afraid of the competition. And so I find that really upsetting personally. And I guess moving forward now, we're moving into an age, right, where people are trying to build 5G. I mean, we have Google building Google Fiber in a lot of neighborhoods. And Facebook, I guess I've seen some initiatives of Facebook and Google really trying to push like building this infrastructure so that we can finally get all this information to these marginalized communities that don't have the infrastructure there. And personally, I'm a bit skeptical of them, and I've actually looked into some articles as well. I was reading recently about a neighborhood where Google was trying to lay their Google Fiber so that more people can get internet access, and faster, stronger internet access. And I guess Google's always, you know, trying to say like, we are like really, you know, trying to bring the information to the world. We're trying to liberate people by connecting them to to communities around the world. I mean, that's like, seems like kind of a part of the way that they've advertised themselves. And so when they talk about trying to lay this infrastructure, they have created plans like, we'll only lay this infrastructure if, let's say, 70% of people within this community sign on to the service and say that they want this Google Fiber installed in their community. And so when you start laying those sorts of rules, you know, well, what happens when most people in a community can't afford the service that Google's trying to get? Then that infrastructure is not going to get built again. Google also had pointed to the fact that they wanted to continue building, that they wanted to, for any communities that had this infrastructure built, they would also provide their service for free at local schools. And so it seems like, again, they're kind of saying, well, these schools should only deserve to have internet access and our services if their communities can afford it. So again, it just seems like they're not really doing anything about the digital divide. They're talking about creating these, you know, great engineering solutions to actually have better tools, but they're not talking about, you know, like trying to actually bring services to our communities and strengthen our communities. I mean, we have moved into the age of information, and when communities don't have control over their own data, they are at risk. And unfortunately are sort of at the mercy of these big organizations like Comcast and Xfinity, Facebook and Google and Amazon that are doing all kinds of things with their information. And so I tend to think, you know, more and more that like we really need to start building more distributed networks. We need people in our own neighborhoods to be building this infrastructure because we have the technology to do this. The technology exists, we just have to use it. We can get more and more people access to the internet, and we can get more and more people connected to networks in their own communities that they own personally. And so this is a big part of what I'm involved in at MassMesh, is we are building mesh networks. This is a quote that I found in an article. This is actually from an interview that happened at the International Summit for Community Wireless to a digital steward from Detroit. I'll get into what digital stewards are in a minute, but mesh networks provide opportunities for our communities to create our own systems instead of waiting for someone to create them for us. This is really what I've been pointing to, is that like we can't wait for organizations like Google or Comcast or any of these big cable companies that are trying to build this infrastructure to do it for us, because frankly, they're not going to do it. And there are a few reasons why they would do it for us, which I believe the main incentive that they would have is if they were able to continue building upon the surveillance technology that is continuing to progress in so many ways, because then they can use this technology to centralize a bunch of data on all of the individuals who are using the internet, which is really powerful for advertising, but also a lot of other things like keeping people in prison. And so just to give you an idea of how our networks are working, or what different network topologies look like, on the left we have a more centralized network topology. This is with the blue dots, this looks kind of like what the internet looks like. The internet's very centralized. In order to communicate with anyone else on the internet, you have to go through the internet first. So you can't actually, using your computer and your own router, you can't communicate directly with someone else through their computer and their router. You need to go through this like big system of wires that's happening underground. Or on our phone lines and stuff. On the right, we have a distributed network. And so this is what we are trying to work on building with mesh nets. Mesh nets are basically more peer-to-peer. They're not centralized, meaning, as I was describing before, your router is allowed to talk directly to your friend's router or your neighbor's router, meaning that you don't actually need access to the internet for your computers to talk to each other. Not saying that we should totally get rid of access to the internet or the internet in general, but just saying that to be connected to your community, we don't need the internet. So I think a big part of, these are a couple of links that I am sharing here. One is a link to designjustice.org. As I had mentioned in my description of this talk, that I wanted to focus on how design justice needs to be incorporated into our network building strategies. And this is a big part of what some of the organizations are doing that I want to talk about. But really, if you want to go to that link and check it out, there are a list of 10 principles on design justice, and most of them focus around this idea that if we want to protect people in our communities, then we need to involve those people in the design process, whether it be with designing our own websites, or as I'm suggesting, designing our own networks. And I guess the idea behind it is that a lot of the time there are design choices that are made at big organizations or anywhere that are focusing on just trying to get attention, trying to work properly, but often they don't really acknowledge the way that some of these design choices might actually harm individuals within marginalized communities. And so what needs to happen is we need to look to those marginalized communities and ask for help as to how can we build this technology in a way that will be more conducive to your community's health. And not just that, but how do we actually involve people in marginalized communities in this design process? And so one of the project that I wanted to talk about today is called the Detroit Community Technology Project. They are one sub-project underneath of the Allied Media Projects. And they had initially gotten a large $1.2 million grant. I guess that's pretty good. And I'm still trying to figure out, how I feel about using grants as a way to kind of kickstart community initiatives. I think they can be really powerful, and but I think that it would be really good to try to figure out a model where a more sustainable model, basically, that actually tries to develop economies locally and in a sustainable manner. I know that is a big challenge. I'm not saying that I have a solution to that, but that's something that I'm thinking about. And so what is, sorry, let me just go back for a second. Okay, so the Detroit Community Technology Project is, they are training digital stewards. Digital stewardship, as this says here, is a principled approach to community technology that emphasizes self-governance and sustainability. I'm not going to read the rest of this, but I think the main point that I want to get to is that the way digital stewards are operating is they're using open source documentation on how to build the technology in our own communities, how to educate people in our own communities on how technology is working and how it affects us individually, and how to use it in a way that builds healthy relationships between all of us. So that's really what they're doing, and the digital stewards are working really hard and using mesh network technology to try to encourage people in these communities and this is happening in Detroit, New York, and a few other places around the world, but how to encourage them to build their own networks and learn to take control of their own networks. And I guess I want to apologize for a second. A part of the difficulty of putting a lot of this together is that there are just a bunch of organizations here that are all related to each other in ways that takes a lot of digging through. But the Equitable Internet Initiative is an initiative that's being done by the Detroit Community Technology Project. And a big part of their goal is to increase internet access through shared gigabit connections, increase internet adoption and community centeredness through their digital stewards program, and increase pathways for Detroit residents into the opportunities of Detroit's tech sector. So some of these goals are not exactly the same as what we're doing at MassMesh, but I do think that they are things that we are interested in trying to learn more about and considering how can we make these things a part of our own program. We're not necessarily looking right now at we're not at a point right now where we're trying to figure out how to create jobs. That's somewhere that we want to get. Right now we're building the tech and we're trying to get communities involved. And maybe at a later point we'll need to figure out our own governance structure. But we're not there yet right now. So really the big thing that we're trying to do is the big thing that we have in common is trying to get these gigabit internet connections within our communities and share them, basically. So I guess for example, we could get one person in our neighborhood to buy a gigabit internet connection and then use mesh networking technology, use our own routers that we own in our community to share that internet connection. That provides a lot of benefits. One of the big ones is that you don't have to rely on Comcast anymore, or maybe a little bit you do. You still need to get your initial connection. But let's just say you get that 1 gigabit internet connection and you get 4 other households in your community to share that one connection. That sort of takes quite a bit back from Comcast. And I think that that's a model that we can start building for ourselves. We have the technology, as I've been saying, we have the technology to do it. And I think that we should really work on trying to bring this technology into our own hands, because unfortunately, it doesn't seem like a lot of technology, at least in the hands of the most powerful, is particularly helpful. And I'm skeptical of seeing more and more of this infrastructure be built when I know that it's going to be used in oppressive ways. So again, like, we really need to get building this technology in the hands of people within their own communities. And so this also is another little excerpt from the International Summit for Community Wireless interview that had been done with the digital stewards of Detroit. They said, in Detroit, we're looking at best practices for establishing trust and building relationships. And so that I guess to put it in a little bit more context, right before this, they had also said that pointed out that a lot of other of these organizations, these network building organizations, are working really hard to try to find, you know, these big like engineering solutions to the digital divide. And the thing is, like, we can keep finding different engineering solutions, right? Like, technology is going to keep moving forward. It's going to keep progressing. It won't stop. And if we allow that to keep happening in that way, like, yeah, we want this like progress to happen, but we don't want to be in a constant state of progress in everything. Like, if we're in a constant state of progress, technological progress, it means that we're always tearing down the things that we've already built, and we're not using the things that we already have that we know work. And sometimes it also means that we're continuing to build things, and the people who are really pushing for that technology to be built are people who might not actually have the interests of the individual, of a community at hand, right? I mean, we're talking about a world where we're creating a larger and larger global economy, and we really need to do everything that we can to try to bring our economies back to a local level as much as possible. Because otherwise I feel that a lot of communities are going to start getting iced out, which is something that is happening around the world. Okay, actually, great segue. So this was a point that was another point that was brought up during this interview, is that a lot of companies, or sorry, a lot of there are a lot of countries around the world, in particular, and this one is pointing out Brazil, that are actually isolating themselves from the internet, from the United States network, because of the amount of surveillance that's been going on. And that, I guess that's, I'm kind of trying to look at this in terms of the digital divide, right? Like, if Brazil has the choice to have access to this global network, right, you would think that's something that they would want. There's so much information, and like, there's so much information available, it gives them connections to so many people around the world, but they close themselves off to it, even though there's so much to gain from it. And I think that, you know, must really make us question, like, well, how is it that United States surveillance programs are actually impacting people, not just in our own country, but people around the world? And I guess it also makes me question, like, to what extent do we actually want people in our own communities to be connected to this network in certain ways anyway, if it's actually really harmful to our own communities, right? And I mean, so that's all the slides I have. I'm gonna keep talking, but I'm gonna take down this screen share. How do I end it? Here we go. Great. So they are, you know, the digital stewards have put a lot of work into continuing actually trying to teach a bunch of people about and teach their communities more and more about this surveillance technology that's going on, because it does have a big impact on people, and the power of having data, access to the data within our own communities, and having control over the data in our own communities. And I think that a lot of the work that they're doing is really powerful. And so I did just want to point to it as a model. And as we at MassMesh are kind of at a slightly earlier stage in our own project, but we are at a point now where we are starting to get some of our own meshnet nodes up, and there are people who are actively trying to get people in their own communities to share these internet connections with each other. And so that's something that we'd really like to make happen. And I know that I had posted earlier in one of the earlier slides, I had posted the link to a Rise Up pad there. And so I really would like, actually, if anyone is interested, if you had any questions that you want to talk about further, if you're interested in scheduling a chat, as I had mentioned earlier, so that we can talk about MassMesh and what it actually means for us to be building our own network, I'd be really happy to talk to you about it. I'd be really happy to invite you to talk to some of the people on our tech team about it, the people who are actually building the technology. Yeah, I guess that's everything that I wanted to say. So I'm really happy that I had this opportunity to share all of this with you. Yes.
So are you willing to take questions for, we have
yes,
time for questions.
Yes, absolutely. I am here for questions.
Yeah, and somebody actually, I'm going to paste the link to the pad in the chat because somebody wanted that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for this. This has been really informative. Thank you so much.
Very good.
One thing I'm worried about, or talking about who's providing the backhaul for these community networks, I'm really worried if they're commercial entities who would be sort of aggressive about protecting their market. For instance, if you ask a person in one of these communities to share their network, I think they may be in violation of some agreement and therefore they may become a target, right? I'm worried about that. And I don't know what the solutions to that are, but I'm sure that's something you've thought about.
Yeah, so there are some solutions. There are things that we've thought about that a lot. That's a really good question. And that's definitely something that we have to think about most of the time. Like we are trying to figure out some technical solutions to make that less of a problem, but also it is a matter of governance. It's technically not really illegal for, like, people can do whatever they want with their bandwidth. They have the right to share it in this way. It's not illegal. Like, it might be against some terms of service or something, which is a different problem. And yeah, that's definitely something that we worry about. But we are, we're trying to really figure out, like, a big part of this is that people in their own neighborhoods, when they want to get involved in this, is that, let's just say we do have someone who's building a, we're calling it an internet buying club, right? Where 5 different houses buy into the internet. Like, people in their communities need to figure out some sort of governance structure. Really, like, building mesh nets is a community activity. This is a way of building relationships between each other, and that's the main reason that we're doing it, is because we're trying to build connections within the community, and a part of that is trying to figure out governance and liability within your own community, and really, like, it shouldn't be a problem for the most part unless somebody's doing something that they ought not be doing on that network, right? And so, like, people on that network need to have that conversation and say, like, how are we going to handle this if someone's doing something that they shouldn't be doing here? That's really all I can say about that right now, but
it might be beneficial if you could post either in the chat here or on your pad contact information for folks to reach out to you.
Okay. Yes, I will. I can do that right now, actually. I'll put my email address in the pad. Cool. I just put my email address at the bottom of the pad. And I can put it in here in the chat as well. Very good.
I have a quick question. I'm really sorry. Is it too noisy? I'm actually driving.
It's a little noisy, but it's not too noisy. Okay.
My question is, in your work, and I'm sure that, forgive me for being a little naive because I haven't been able to go to those links, although I have heard of RiseUp.net, but do people ever talk about ham radio? Speaking of old technology that still works?
Yeah, actually there is some talk of using ham radio by some of the people at MassMesh. I personally do not have a ham radio certification, but it's something that I would be really excited to get into. So I'm happy to hear you talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty cool. And then I guess my other question was just, and forgive me if you mentioned this earlier in the talk, but like, well, clearly this all sounds awesome and ambitious, and I'm excited to read more about it. But sometimes I just wonder, in small ways, there's so many people in my life who are active, like, who are doing like community organizing work, or really, even if it's just not formal, but either way, whether they're formally doing policy work or not. And it's like also relying on Facebook and the Facebook group. And
yeah.
I'm just curious if there are ways that, I guess, yeah, I mean, just in what ways people are working to like, sometimes I just feel like the humble listserv needs like a big marketing push or something, just things like this. So I'm sure you guys are doing all kinds of stuff like that. I was just being lazy because you're here and I thought I'd ask you about it.
I mean, right. And I guess I'm trying to figure out exactly what you want to ask right now. Are you trying to ask about like how we network in general, like how we use?
Oh, no, not you guys, but
okay.
It just sometimes seems like a curious thing to me that so many people on the left are the means of communication they're using, and I understand why. It's because everyone's there. All of their constituents are already there. Yeah. But I feel like that the monopoly that is Facebook and the way that they're using data, I mean, obviously we all know the problems it's caused, but it seems like even in very lefty circles, when I try and bring this up, I think people's heads just spin because it seems like, how could we not breathe the air? And so I was just curious to hear if you had like hopeful moments about that or people that you knew of that were trying, just because there are so many other ways to, you know, have group communication, but it seems that people under 30 have forgotten about them. So
yeah. I mean, I've had a lot of times I've been very frustrated, you know, for a while about a lot of this. This is a really dear subject, of course. Like, how are all these people using Facebook in the way that they are? Like, I do find it really painful. Personally, I used Facebook for like a couple of years in my late teens, and I hated it. I like couldn't stay on it. I found it really, like, it felt like it really violated me personally, and it would just even through its kind of like addictive design. But I do think that there is a lot of hope in that, like, some of the work that I am involved in right now is more and more about trying to build online resources, informational and communication resource. Not me personally building them, but just like organizing people to build them and try to make these things happen where we do have resources that are under more ownership of the community, right? And so, like, are you familiar with the platform cooperative movement?
What, work around businesses? Is that what you said? I couldn't hear you.
Platform cooperativism.
Oh no, that's exciting. Maybe I'm not so familiar with that.
Okay, so it's a relatively newer thing, but basically it's the idea that we could use technology, and the typical example is like Uber as an example. Like, imagine if we had a platform like Uber, except Uber was owned by the people in the community that used it, right? Like, the platform itself was owned by the drivers, and it was owned by the people who needed those rides, right? So that, like, then there was more like voting power in like actually how that economy works, as opposed to just like, you know, giving away this like all this money that's just getting sucked up by like developers and people who own this platform. I mean, it's totally ridiculous, right? Like, that money's not theirs. It belongs in the community. So like, there are solutions that are happening, and there are people who are, you know, trying to make these things happen, including myself. And so I am a huge advocate of that type of software, and these types of localized communities. Like, I think that's a big part of really what a lot of us are looking forward to. And I do think there's a place for it, you know, but unfortunately, sometimes looking at, like, you know, how many people use Facebook is a little disheartening. Like, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, a little.
Yeah.
But that's exciting. I'll look up platform cooperatives. I mean, I've heard about like.
Uh-oh.
Oh, oops. Sorry.
Yeah, I lost you a little bit.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, that's very exciting. I mean, I just have barely like begun to get into the world of Mastodon, and that's kind of cool. So it's awesome. Everything you're doing is great. Thank you for doing it and for telling us about it. And
awesome.
I'll stop talking because it's probably really loud and annoying. But